So I'd like to introduce Daniel. Daniel Richter is a lecturer in the history department at the University of Maryland, where he received his doctorate in 2016. He's revising his manuscript, Mirrored Cities, Buenos Aires, Montevideo and Mass Urban Culture, 1910 to 1960, and working on a new project about gated communities in metropolitan Buenos Aires in the recent fin de siècle. He has been awarded a Fulbright Faculty Award in Argentina 2020 and has also received support from the Uruguayan Fulbright Commission in 2012. He's published various articles about the urban and cultural histories of Argentina and Uruguay. So please welcome Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thank you very much to Lola, the organizers, and all of my fellow panelists. It's been a wonderful conference so far. Let me begin. So throughout 2017, the national government of Uruguay and the municipal government of Montevideo, Uruguay's capital, both planned various forms of cultural programming to honor the centennial of the tango, La Cumpersita, composed by Montevideo native Gerardo Matos Rodríguez and performed by the orchestra of Argentine pianist Roberto Firpo at the Montevideo Café La Giralda in April 1917. The centennial events included recitals and musical plays at different theaters, 100 milongas, tango dance nights, organized in towns throughout Uruguay, a photography exhibition about the life of Matos Rodríguez at Montevideo's Municipal Photography Museum, and an open-air public concert in Montevideo commemorating the song's history during the country's Natural Heritage Day on October 7th and October 8th, 2017. Within these celebrations of La Cumpersita, Uruguay's cultural policymakers sought to redefine Montevideo's role as the shared birthplace of tango with neighboring Buenos Aires, a policy that has increasingly been advanced by Uruguayan state authorities in the early 21st century. In April 2017, Montevideo's city government opened the Museo del Tango La Cumpersita in the ground floor of the city's iconic Palacio Salvo skyscraper, which you can see in the background here behind the sculpture, which I'm going to talk about in a second. In the ground floor of the city's iconic Palacio Salvo skyscraper to attract local and international tourists. This museum was conceived to appeal to tourists interested in tango while visiting Montevideo and serve as a counterpart to the Museo Mundial del Tango in Buenos Aires, established in 2003. In various articles published in 2017, global media outlets depicted Montevideo's efforts to be considered as tango's other city alongside Buenos Aires. The director of the Museo de Tango La Cumpersita explained, "It's the sound and symbol of tango. It's the living testimony that Uruguay is the co-founder of tango with Argentina and speaks of a time when the culture of the entire River Plate was sparkling with creativity." As part of concerted public relations efforts, Uruguayans emphasized to global journalists the importance of La Cumpersita being composed by Matos Rodríguez in 1916, and then becoming among the genre's most recognized compositions after its initial performance. Uruguayan diplomats also sought to globalize the celebrations around La Cumpersita centennial by sponsoring a tango concert in New York City at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan in September 2017, and earlier that year in April, Iberia Airlines had provided commemorative publications about La Cumpersita to every passenger flying the route from Madrid to Montevideo. The Uruguayan cultural policies around tango continued into the following year. In October 2018, the city government of Montevideo aimed to promote the country's national heritage with a monumental commemoration of La Cumpersita as the world's most famous tango. A 4-foot-long and 1.2-meter-high sculpture made of iron, marble, and glass, this is what we have here on the screen, was created by the Uruguayan artist Giorgio Calevaro in the form of a bandoneon, the most representative musical instrument in tango. The inauguration ceremony for the sculpture located near the country's presidential palace in the rebaptized Plaza Gerardo Matos Rodríguez, Montevideo's mayor, Daniel Martinez, said that La Cumpersita means a great deal for tango and for Uruguay. It has become the veritable anthem in tango and was composed by a Uruguayan. Today, we are trying to use the song as a figurehead that allows us to create value around tango. He also explained how Montevideo could not aspire to having the same number of tourists as Buenos Aires, but the tango could help to grow Montevideo's appeal. Martinez also said, in quotes, "We have to develop cultural and artistic activity around tango, which is a music deeply rooted in our society. We cannot aspire to become Buenos Aires since we cannot compete with a megacity. We cannot generate $200 million a year in tourism revenue, but could reach $20 million 10 years from now. With these statements, Martinez's analysis of tango's cultural heritage also helps to explain the complicated uneven ties that have linked Montevideo and Buenos Aires during tango's long history, reaching back to its origins during the latter decades of the 19th century. This paper explores how Montevideo and Buenos Aires' contemporary shared histories of tango culture from the late 1990s through the early 21st century can be understood in parallel to the period in the early 20th century from approximately 1910 to 1930. It also contextualizes the elements of nostalgia at the heart of tango's global histories. In the early 21st century, tango has expanded its global publics, and Argentina and Uruguay have cooperated on several aspects of cultural policy to drive these economic benefits, while also respectively appealing to the economic components of musical nostalgia and tourism. In 2009, Argentina and Uruguay received approval for their joint submission to include tango on the UNESCO World Heritage List of Cultural Treasures. The anthropologist Morgan Luker has highlighted the meanings of this patrimonial declaration in his book, The Tango Machine, about the political and economic importance of these types of cultural policies in Argentina in the early 21st century. These policies include the promotion of tourism related to tango, public art, tango festivals, and new museums like the Museo Carlos Gardel in Buenos Aires' Abasto neighborhood that was inaugurated in 2003. Expanding on Luker's work, I argue that comparing cultural policies in Uruguay and Argentina in the last decades helped to understand his formulation concerning how tango in Argentina has been, in quotes, called upon and often compelled to address social, political, and economic problems that were previously located by theorists and practitioners alike outside the cultural domain, end quotes. This paper pursues a more historically minded intervention to critically examine how the similar cultural policies around tango have accelerated in Uruguay over the last 15 years, and to reflect on the absence of Montevideo in many contemporary discussions of tango. As one telling example, the excellent work of the anthropologist Melissa Fitch has explored the global imaginaries of tango in urban centers around the world. Fitch discusses Uruguay's foundational role in the early 20th century history of tango, but then concentrates on tango's global reception and sustenance around the world in places such as Argentina, France, Japan, Taiwan, India, Italy, Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In Uruguay, the advancement of cultural policy as part of tango has decidedly increased and also coincided with the left-wing government of the Broad Front of Uruguay, led by Presidents Tabaré Vázquez and Jose Mujica. And so this paper is considering how contemporary tango is constructed heavily by economic forces, to consider tango's imagined place in Argentina and Uruguay's natural cultures, and also to understand how this is mobilizing nostalgia and also considering the impact of nostalgia on tango scholarship as well. In addition, the paper explores the transnational and comparative frames, considering how tangueros in Montevideo position themselves alongside tango's capital, Buenos Aires, as well as Paris, New York, and other urban sites that have defined the music's long history of global urban crossings. Montevideo and Buenos Aires are most commonly paired in tango history in its period of origins. In the second half of the 19th century, popular class neighborhoods in Montevideo and Buenos Aires function as the birthplaces of the musical elements that would coalesce into what early 20th century Uruguayans and Argentines considered as tango. When tango became a global phenomenon in the early decades of the 20th century, Buenos Aires became increasingly recognized as its authentic birthplace by many observers, while Montevideo remained understood by aficionados as an important but secondary site for creation and performance by many of tango's most important performers, composers, and lyricists from both Uruguay and Argentina. For Uruguayan historians, Montevideo's place was predicated on Matos Rodríguez's composition of La Cumpersita, while Uruguay's role was obscured in the creation of other tangos. For example, the Uruguayan Carlos César Lenzi wrote the lyrics of the 1925 tango A Media Luz with the melody composed by the Argentine Edgardo Donato for a musical review titled Su Majestad a Revista at the Teatro Catalunya in Montevideo. A Media Luz became among tango's most iconic songs in its reflections of nostalgia. It is a meditation on lost love in an apartment in downtown Buenos Aires, located at the address of Corrientes 348. The song contributed to Corrientes Street's place in the musicscape of tango, and soon formed part of the repertoire of tango's most famous singer, Carlos Gardel, in the 1920s with his recording of A Media Luz. In 1930, the Uruguayan tango Adios Mi Barrio also gained recognition on both sides of the Rio de la Plata, emphasizing urban nostalgia with its meaning transposed from an original work setting in working class and historically Afro-Uruguayan neighborhoods of Barrio Sur in Montevideo to being simultaneous about the working class and immigrant neighborhoods in the southern regions of Buenos Aires. The nostalgia of tangos about Buenos Aires was deeply present at the songs of Gardel in the late 1920s, with songs such as Anclaudo in Paris and the works of female cancioneras such as Azucena Maicena with her Pero Yo Sé, and Rosita Quiroga singing about Puente Alsina. When tango becomes a global recorded phenomenon in the 1920s and 1930s, largely through the presence of international recording companies, Montevideo was stripped of its musical protagonism once again, because Buenos Aires becomes recognized as the place where tango recordings take place, and also becomes a global musical cultural capital along with cities such as London, Paris, Madrid, Berlin, and New York. As well, tango musicians are also increasingly identified with the urban world split between Buenos Aires and Paris, as the two globalized musical cities shaped many iconic tango songs and their elements of nostalgia. And in the 19-teens and 1920s, Buenos Aires has many recording studios open up, and Montevideo has essentially none. And
Daniel.
5-minute warning?
No, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering, I just realized that your presentation is not on full screen mode.
Oh, okay. That's what I was asking about earlier. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just, I was wondering, you know, why the slides weren't changing, and I think that might be why. But you've still got 5 minutes until your 5-minute warning.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Thanks, Chrissy. So, all right, so let me just actually talk through a couple of the slides so we move through those. So the first one is the image of the, can you guys, Chrissy, am I blocking myself or no? I'm not sure if I'm doing this wrong.
No, this is fine. This is fine. You can click through the slides, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, so this is an image of the interior of the Museo del Tango La Cumpersita. And then here is some of the early advertising as well as the music for La Cumpersita. And then I'll take a minute to actually talk through elements and examples of the recent kind of public demonstrations of tango culture in Montevideo. So here we have a recent, I think this is a statue of Carlos Gardel on Montevideo's main avenue that's put up in 2017 outside one of the main cafes in the downtown corridor. And then this is an older bust of Carlos Gardel that is located in a plaza in Barrio Sur, but previously when it had first been created in the 1940s, it had been put inside the park. So here's the original ceremony of it, and then it's moved. But as you can see, the representation of Gardel is put out by this cafe as well as sponsored by Montevideo at this moment in time when they're trying to emphasize tango in the physical landscape of the city. So over in Buenos Aires, you have art related to tango that goes back, several decades in many cases. This is among the most famous pieces of tango art. It's a painting by the Uruguayan painter Carlos Baez Villaro, who lived in Buenos Aires and also did work there. And here is Gardel with Buenos Aires' obelisk as his necktie. And onto the next slide, we see one of the more recent statues of Gardel in Buenos Aires in the Abasto neighborhood. And here is the exterior of the Museo Carlos Gardel, which is only opened in 2003 and then renovated over time. And then onto the next slide, we see that Baez Villaro paints a different mural in Abasto, again with the image of Gardel copying part of it, as well as showing other aspects of Abasto when it was the wholesale market of the city, and putting tango's history within the idea of it being a neighborhood with its own defined character. Okay. One of the other things is that the Baez Villaro murals are reflective of the long history of tango in Argentine and Uruguayan visual art. So on the left, we have a painting by the Argentine painter Emilio Petrucci, who's inspired by the abstract work of Picasso. And here is among his most famous tango paintings, bailarines, dancers. And then on the right, you have a painting by the Uruguayan painter Pedro Figari, En la Calle, on the street, which shows the presence of Afro-Uruguayans and others dancing tango in the street of Montevideo. And in addition, in recent years, Buenos Aires' subway has included different types of murals and public art related to tango, and specifically related to the famous Argentine composer and performer Astor Piazzolla. Here is one of the paintings of him in the subway that's completed in 2000. And more recently, there's another one of Piazzolla with Anibal Troya, one of the other famous figures in tango, also done by Sabat, who's a Uruguayan who immigrates to Buenos Aires, like so many of these other peoples we're talking about. Okay. So jumping back to this period of the early 20th century, when Montevideo is fundamental in the early period of tango. On the right, we see one of the advertisements for the record music stores owned by the Argentine businessman Max Glucksmann, who is a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe to Buenos Aires, and he owns many of the record stores and eventually becomes the major movie impresario in Buenos Aires. And on the right, we have an advertisement from 1919 of his store advertising the work of Gardel and Razzano, recording some of their early work. And on the left, we see that in Buenos Aires, in the major magazine Caras y Caretas, also an advertisement advertising the work of Roberto Firpo, as well as Gardel and Razzano. And it also is part of where we see performances taking place in Buenos Aires, and it lists the different places where Glucksmann has his stores, which include in Buenos Aires, as well as in the other Argentine cities of Rosario and Cordoba, and the idea of Montevideo being a regional pairing to Buenos Aires. Okay. And here's on the next slide an image of some of the orchestras, such as the Donato Orchestra and Zerillo, which includes Argentine and Uruguayan musicians that are based in Montevideo in the 1920s and the 1930s. So, you know, with the time that I have remaining, I mean, I'm happy to share the paper where I talk more about the recent rise of electronic tango in Argentine and Uruguay, as well as Argentine and Uruguayan musicians that have lived around the world, such as the members of Bajo Fondo, as well as Gotan Project. But in the last few minutes that I have, Chris, are we at the 5-minute mark now?
Yes, we are. I was about to interrupt you again.
I actually like to play the two songs that I want to play. The first is this tango, Adios Mi Barrio, Goodbye My Neighborhood, from 1930, which becomes appropriated by Argentine musicians, where they essentially change the meaning and sometimes improvise with the lyrics to talk about the southern neighborhoods of Buenos Aires. And it has this similarity that the southern neighborhoods in both Buenos Aires and Montevideo are more associated with the working class areas, the port workers, and in the case of, in Montevideo, the Afro-Uruguayan community that remains a large visibility through the 20th century. So let me go ahead and play the Adios Mi Barrio, and then I'll close with a more recent tango sung by a Uruguayan tango singer for the 21st century, which also speaks to elements of nostalgia. Okay, so let me go ahead and put on Adios Mi Barrio. pause there, and happy to share the music with everybody as well as provide the PowerPoint, which includes some translations of the lyrics. So this is the song that I also think speaks to this renewal of connections between Montevideo and Buenos Aires in the 21st century. And the song by Laura Canora, Uruguayan tango singer, also really juxtaposes and mixes elements of nostalgia between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, talking about returning to Montevideo from Europe through the airport, and also having memories of places in both Montevideo and Buenos Aires.
Empezaron a soñar con el regreso en la puerta principal del aeropuerto. Las valijas repletas de ilusiones, los bolsillos vacíos y con miedo. Se llevaron de memoria el obelisco, las siluetas de la Plaza Libertad, y en el medio del pecho la nostalgia para abrirla en un regalo en Navidad. Los hijos de Gardel nunca supieron que aquello de volver era real. Se agarraron al lugar con alfileres y dejaron las valijas sin guardar. Sobre todo hablan siempre el uruguayo, aunque nadie los entienda, ¿qué más da? Y practican el despegue a cada rato cuando ven que con sus hijos es igual. Cada tanto les mandamos unas fotos con la Rambla o Sarandí peatonal para hacerles más liviano el desapego al país donde se fueron a emigrar.
And so what we see here is that the traditional tango of Canora, again, mixing these elements of nostalgia for Buenos Aires and Montevideo, is also part of a rebirth of 21st century traditional compositions and song lyrics. And it also coincides, of course, with the electronic tango. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you see how this, of course, has really expanded the audience for tango and really made it seem as if Argentine and Uruguay's musical traditions are again kind of coalescing into one like they did in the early 21st century. So I will end there. Thank you guys so much for your attention, and I hope that the audio and everything worked out.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And that was, yeah, thank you for a fantastic paper. I'm just sorry that I had to interrupt you, but I'm actually very happy that I did, because it was wonderful to see, you know, the relationship between tango and architecture and visual culture and and you know, how tango, the historicization of it, is bound up with the built environment and with statues and museums and monumentalizations. And it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. There are quite a few questions that have been flooding in. So I will go through these, starting with a question from Kirsty Bennett. She says, can you say anything more on the position of Montevideo and tango during the golden age of tango, mid-30s, early 50s approx? You mentioned that Montevideo disappeared during the technological recording boom of the 20s and 30s. So I was wondering what happened in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, great question. So I don't know if I'd say disappeared, but it's increasingly overshadowed in that period. And in the 1940s and 1950s, what you see is the migration of many Uruguayan tangueros to Buenos Aires. The most famous is Julio Sosa, who is one of the most famous performers known for his machismo with tango. And he makes his way to Buenos Aires, where he lives and dies in a car crash on one of the major avenues of the city while driving his sports car too fast. But he's recognized as a national hero in Uruguay, and they'll go back and they'll perform in Montevideo, but if they want to cut their records, they're going to do it in Buenos Aires. And this also is the case for what I study in the realm of cinema, as well as other forms of theater. And as well, there's many famous cases of Uruguayan writers, as well as the political exiles that flow back and forth for depending on censorship in Uruguay or in Argentina. And so Buenos Aires continues in the golden age of tango. Figures like Julio Sosa move there, live there, record there, and go back and forth to Montevideo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question from Amanda Shi. I wonder if you can say a little more about Gardel as a representative of tango in the context of colonialism. Has his reception changed over the years?
Well, this is a great question, which I did not get into, is that Gardel's origin of birth is frequently debated as part of the national heritage of tango. And there are three possibilities. One is Argentina, one is Uruguay, and the other one is France. And so this has to do with when Uruguay asserts Gardel as being part of the birthplace of tango because of his early performances in Montevideo, they're also asserting his hidden origins, being born in a small town in Uruguay. And the newspapers in Uruguay love to bring up the latest and greatest research into Gardel's origins. There's a work by an Argentine historian about tango, about Gardel being Uruguayan. And of course, the Uruguayan press love this. In terms of the idea of colonialism, there's elements of how Uruguayans feel that they're colonized by Argentine culture, especially in the realms of tango, as well as the elements of mass culture, specifically film, which I also study. And so this all is part of that. Of course, Gardel is a very global figure because he lives and makes tango movies in places like Paris and New York. And so this is all part of his, mystique, as well as why his legacy is debated.
Thank you. I'm just picking up on a comment from earlier in the chat from Heloisa Valente, and this links to another comment by Richard Elliott. So Heloisa said, thank you very much. I've been studying tango. Your approach reminds me of Nora's lieu de mémoire, considering musical pieces as kinds of memory. And then Richard Elliott said, I agree with the reference to Nora's memory places. I'm very struck by parallels with Portuguese fado in terms of music bearing witness to the city via a genre that is very much associated with these cities. So I just wanted to put that to you in case you would like to speak to it.
Absolutely, that's a great question. And one of the very interesting things about these cities is how memory politics work, especially in and around aspects of state terrorism in the late 20th century. And so the democratic governments from the 1980s and increasingly in the 20th century have put up numerous sites related to human rights. You also have the felling of the Columbus statue in Buenos Aires a number of years ago, being replaced by an indigenous woman. And so there's definitely a connection between the tango sculptures and the tango construction of the memory sites, as well in the realms of memory, as you see with these questions about human rights and remembering the recent past. And that's something that and other scholars have worked on this, but when I write about this, especially with Uruguay, to connect it to this landscape of human rights. I mean, that's fundamental, and I'm really excited to hear more what Richard talks about with Fado and Lisbon. That's something that I've always been interested in thinking about as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I think maybe time for one more question. This is from John van der Vet, who said, could one speculate that Buenos Aires's mainstream connection to tango could also be due to a globalized and romanticized image of what tango was? And perhaps Buenos Aires just happened to create a much more attractive image. How much did societal opinions play?
So that's a very interesting, question. And I agree wholeheartedly with the first part, that of course the romanticized image of tango and romance in Buenos Aires during this year is appealing to visitors as well as from Argentine elites as being the Paris of South America, and its own process of Haussmannization, which takes place around its centennial. And so I agree with that. As to Buenos Aires creating a more attractive image, I think it's a more commercial image. And again, this gets back to thinking about the elements of recording as part of tango history and how that obscures Montevideo's role. And of course, at the same time, Buenos Aires is just a much larger city, which from the early 20th century, it's essentially the second largest city in the Western Hemisphere. And it's 7 times the size of Montevideo now, and it has a massive cultural industry. So it's not just attractive, it's a more commercialized, it's more massive, and it's also part of the elements of national character. And that ties into that question about rural nostalgia, that the nostalgias that exist in tango are fragments, but they exist everywhere from elements of the rural past to a lost romance, to home, to a neighborhood, to a city. And that's what makes it such a nostalgic genre, but also, of course, it's defined by so many urban processes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel. And I, for one, would love to hear more about what you mentioned about your work on electronic tango and the evolving relationship, I guess, between the cities. So hopefully I'll get a chance to look at that. Thank you so much. That concludes our panel.